DaRon Holmes might be your team's ideal front court partner. This is Floor and Ceiling. Let's break him down. Before we really kick things off, I wanted to give a quick thank you for reaching 1 million YouTube views. The support is very much appreciated and the best is yet to come. The pitch on DaRon Holmes surrounds the idea of him being scalable next to other elite level bigs at both the 4 and the 5. After 3 seasons of versatile two-way production, Holmes has long been a draft community favorite, and I think he has a very real chance of becoming a valuable NBA contributor. I have DaRon around the very early 20s on my personal big board, but I do think he could make sense as early as number 9 to Memphis. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that the questions about Holmes are valid. His volume in certain aspects was low, as we'll get into. His translation is still very much theoretical in my opinion, and his competition level at Dayton wasn't the strongest, even though this last item is the least of my concerns. In his junior year for the Flyers, Holmes averaged about 20 points, 8 rebounds, 3 assists, and 2 blocks per game. All of this came with the ability to play above the rim and finish plays, as well as intriguing flashes of ball handling and shooting at about 6'10" in shoes with a 7'1" wingspan. But given that Holmes is a big, let's start with the staple for any NBA big, and that is the pick and roll. I don't find DaRon to be super bouncy, but I do find him really fluid and coordinated on his rolls. At surface level, his volume and efficiency this season at the basket was very good. Holmes made about 67% of his shots at the rim on more than 220 attempts, while also having 71 dunks for the year. This lines up with how the Dayton big has been dominant in the paint for years on about 200 shots per season. Holmes has decent hands and body control, which in turn lets him play in traffic without wasted motion. DaRon is not that physical, but he does make some contact on his screens, and then he has timing and intention when it comes to rolling and playing above the rim. The Flyers prospect screens and rolls out of handoffs, which fits what today's NBA big does, and in college, we also often saw him pick and roll into a post-up. You might be wondering why I mentioned that Holmes' numbers at the rim were very good on surface level, and that is because I have some concerns. For one, he only made about 55% of his layups, which is not amazing, and he doesn't really have a runner or a floater to his game either. Holmes also didn't consistently face NBA level competition in the Atlantic 10, so everything that he does, I think, will need to go up a couple more levels than some other prospects around the lottery. Holmes finished a lot of post-ups in college, and we'll dive into that later and what that means, but he won't be doing that as much in the NBA, so he'll need to be even more consistently aggressive and forceful when he goes to finish. However, it's crucial to note that Holmes can do more out of screens than just score. A massive part of his appeal is his processing and his passing. DaRon averaged slightly more than 2.5 assists per night, and I think some of his playmaking should definitely carry over once he gets to the NBA. In particular, I'm referring to how he finds others out of short rolls and out of handoffs. Holmes understands how to leverage his rolling, as well as his popping, which we'll get into very shortly, in order to get his teammates open looks. In general, he's comfortable with the ball in his hands for a big. He gets to do a lot in the offense, so that reminds me a little bit of Nick Claxton in college. Of course, similar to how Claxton did a lot during his university years, DaRon's 31+% usage will not carry over to the NBA. He'll need to adjust to much more of a complementary role, but I do think that spoke to how Dayton trusted Holmes to make a lot of decisions a lot of the time. Other than those types of passes, then Holmes also created a lot of looks with his back to the basket in college. Like I said earlier, I'm not expecting the Dayton prospect to play out of the block as much once he's a pro, but again, he did show vision. Holmes could touch the paint, scan the floor, and handle pressure. However, I am slightly hesitant to make more of these post passes since they probably will not be a part of Holmes' next role. Sticking to the topic of screens, Holmes can also shoot out of them. I think here is where we have to be careful with DaRon's draft profile. Holmes shot about 39% from 3 this season, and that goes up to 40% on catch and shoots. On paper, that sounds great, but we have to be aware Holmes only made 32 threes in his junior season. As for his mark on catch and shoots, well, that goes down to 24% when we look at shots that were categorized as being guarded. This means that we're looking at low volume, but it's also low versatility given that Holmes kinda only makes wide open threes. I think there's some value here. Holmes isn't a non-shooter, and there's definitely been some development to his credit. As a freshman, Holmes only made 1 of his 7 attempted threes, which only went up to 6 for 19 as a sophomore. That could both be a red flag or a positive trajectory depending on how you look at it. However, I have to note that his shooting numbers from other areas around the floor are also not that encouraging. So even though Holmes can make some threes, I would be putting the brakes on billing him as a shooting big. Once he gets drafted, I expect him to not be treated as a threat from deep until he proves otherwise. At the top of the video, I mentioned that Holmes shows flashes of ball handling, and I think that these pop up most when he's finishing. Bridging between how he shoots, handles, and finishes, we saw some moments this season of Holmes popping out and then getting back in with a drive. The Dayton prospect is fluid and long when he puts the ball on the ground. He's not a massively bouncy athlete, but Holmes moves very logically, if that makes sense, with how he separates and finishes. DaRon carves out interesting angles for himself above the rim, but I think his preferred move is going right and then left, usually with a spin. There were even some times when Holmes ran some inverted pick and roll with a guard screening for him, but I don't want to overstate it. It's not like this was a super regular occurrence. He's not going to do as much in the NBA, most likely it will never be his role, but he did do this in college, it's worth analyzing, and it shows a high comfort level even under pressure. This might be demanding on my behalf, but given what Holmes has shown me, the hope for him should be at least to become a grab and go guy who can bring his team up the floor off a miss. Of course, if the 3 falls and defenders start falling out, then Holmes should be able to attack that and get into the paint. However, in all fairness, that might always be kinda theoretical, as we've seen with Isaiah Stewart over the last couple of seasons and his 3-point shot. Like in the pick and roll, it's a similar story with Holmes' finishing in these predicaments. DaRon put up sturdy numbers, but I still have questions about the physical and functional translations of what he does. By that, I mean that Holmes has decent size, but it was much better in college to play the 5 than it is in the NBA. I also don't see him at all as a full-time 4, so it might be a situation where DaRon's fit is very dependent on who else is on the team. Through all of this, the baseline is that he'll have to way downscale his role and his touches. The usage rate in college will be the highest that he sees going forward. I'm high on DaRon. Like I said, his draft range for me starts making sense in the top 10. And as I've been saying all along, I value those flashes of versatility, but I also don't believe that his success in the NBA is a surefire guarantee at all right now. Going ahead though, I'll be more focused on whether Holmes can fulfill what I call the basics of being a big. By that, I'm referring to some things that he already does actually. For instance, screening and rolling with a consistent motor, although Holmes can still stand to be more physically imposing. I also mean rim running hard and early, which should be way more prevalent for DaRon going forward rather than pacing the ball up. The biggest adjustment in my eyes will be staying engaged while seeing and having the ball way less. For example, these pull-up reps are not efficient looks at all, even if they were on low volume at Dayton. DaRon also had a slight tendency to over-dribble or try passes that did not necessarily exist, but once again being fair, I think that's linked to how much his team needed from him. Going forward, Holmes won't be posting up for 10 seconds anymore, but he'll be having to do things like crashing the boards even more aggressively or quickly catching and finishing rather than dissecting the defense. I feel positive about DaRon Holmes on defense, but it is highly contextual. He was productive as a junior, averaging a smidge over 2 blocks per game, and it's not like he was just hunting rejections or jumping at everything. Holmes reads the game well on both ends, and I think that this is apparent with his blocks. DaRon is athletic, he's not super bouncy as I've been pointing out, but he has quick reactions and ground coverage. When he can hang back at the rim, track a drive, and make a play at the ball, Holmes can certainly be effective. In college, this usually came at the 5, but I have a feeling that this will be a little less defined once he's in the NBA. Still though, Holmes is long, fluid, and aware. He can backpedal in space to a degree while still leaving his feet quickly, much like with the speed he moves as a help defender. Looking at what we can learn from his rim protection and his work in the pick and roll, I thought that Holmes was at his best when he didn't have to play super high up the floor. Like I said, he moves okay in space, but I don't think it's well enough to the point where I would genuinely consider him very switchy. DaRon should probably be able to check some wings over a possession or two, but I think he's much more effective closer to the rim where he can be disruptive with his length and his recognition. Otherwise, Holmes can struggle with smaller, faster attackers to a point where I think that it would be a concern once he's in the NBA. The biggest limitation for Holmes on defense is that he's much more of a tweener on this end than he is on offense when we're looking at his career as a pro. The Flyers forward doesn't have awesome measurements for an NBA big, being comparable to someone like Chimezie Metu or Nikola Jovic, who are not bigs. It can be a simple matter of physics, with DaRon giving up height, length, or maybe the most common one, strength against larger fives. Holmes has a good defensive motor and he'll play smart most of the time, but ultimately he's limited in certain aspects. Evidently, this shows up in the post, although I think that this can be offset to an extent. Holmes competes, and in my scenarios for him, he's going to a team with a true rim protector in the front court, so maybe he'll just need to hold up and let the help come. But even then, there are definitely other problems. Going back to the pick and roll, which is what every NBA big does a ton, Holmes cannot take away some angles that bigger and longer fives have access to. For example, when it comes to breaking up some lobs, DaRon's radius is not sufficiently large to erase the pass. So ultimately, I like a lot of the tools that Holmes has, as well as how he plays, but there are valid questions for me regarding his dependence on team context. DaRon Holmes makes sense for lottery-range teams, starting even as early as Memphis with Jaren Jackson, and then OKC with Chet, Miami with Bam, the Lakers with AD, or the Cavs with Evan Mobley. He's shown real flashes of finishing plays on both ends, and then some creation as well, but there are real reasons to wonder about his translation, his volume, and his versatility. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, make sure to leave a comment telling me what you think of DaRon Holmes, and if you enjoy the channel, if you want to watch more content like this, make sure to subscribe. Take care, and I'll catch you guys next time.